So, Scott, what I want to do is obviously look back on this Supreme Court term that is now ended and note the important cases that have an impact right now, and also look into some of those cases that may not have massive impact at the moment, but appear to head down a trajectory. I guess we should probably take the most recent decisions first. And that, of course, would be two cases that came down just last week. One is the Department of Commerce versus New York. This dealt with the census question on immigration, or I should say immigration status or citizenship status. And the other was a series of cases, Rucho versus Common Cause, which was rolled into another case, Benezek versus Lemon, which were the gerrymandering cases. Let's start with the good news, and then we'll just get darker as we go on. And that seems to me to come from the census case.
Right. So, and it's kind of remarkable in that, after oral arguments, most people were very pessimistic about the Department of Commerce had tried to add a question about citizenship to the census, even though the Census Department, had evidence that this would substantially reduce participation of minority communities, especially people of Latino descent. And certainly after oral argument, it didn't look good. One interesting thing that happened is that the estranged daughter of the architect of this question basically found a thumb drive with a bunch of his emails that were brought to the attention of the lower courts that, were basically the smoking gun, that, literally, let's do this because it'll suppress the counting of racial minorities, which means less federal funding, less federal representation, and it would provide information that would allow for even more egregious gerrymandering, as we'll get to next time. And
let me just say, you're not being metaphorical, and you're barely paraphrasing. I mean, I think the words were it would strengthen, it would empower non-white Latinos and Republicans. I think was like directly from that report and modeling that he did.
Yeah, it was like that. I'm not even exaggerating. I guess it was really saying the quiet parts loud. And what's even more ridiculous is that the stated reason that the Commerce Department gave for making the change is that it would help the Trump administration enforce the Voting Rights Act. The irony being not only that the Roberts Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, but literally the Trump administration has not filed a single lawsuit to enforce the Voting Rights Act since coming into power. Obviously Roberts couldn't cite that evidence, but it seems likely, particularly given that he cited, he was much more generous to the Trump administration than was really warranted. In addition to the impermissible motives, really the regulation was just incompetently put forward, and the lower courts just gave very careful, persuasive evidence that it violated the Administrative Procedures Act. And Roberts, didn't buy any of those arguments. He's bending over backwards to defer to the Trump administration, but he basically just had to conclude like the explanations offered by Ross and the evidence are just too inconsistent. Like it's just more or less it's just don't lie this egregiously. Essentially, you're making me look bad. Now what was interesting is that Roberts is Breyer for the three other liberals wrote an opinion essentially arguing the question is inherently bad the way it was put forward in a way that wouldn't have given any practical time for it to be on the census. Roberts just said it should go back to the lower courts, more or less inviting the Department of Commerce to come up with something that didn't embarrass them quite as much. But in the interim, lawyers in the Department of Justice have suggested that the census will go forward without the question. And I would suspect that and of course Trump today came out and said fake news. But I think what the actual lawyers are saying is that, you don't want that smoking gun evidence. Now lower courts can consider that. Basically that I think lawyers in the Department of Justice just want this all to go away so they don't make arguments that will, humiliate them down the road.
Scott, I got to tell you, I think it gets worse than that, too, because yesterday, Donald Trump, in being asked by the press about that question, at some type of conference they were having at the White House. When he was asked that question, he immediately went into the problems that we have with immigrants in this country. And that to me also, if the answer is it's the Voting Rights Act, or if the answer is we need it to perform these and that functions, Donald Trump, again, blew it for them because he went out and said, no, it's something totally different, not what we offered the court the first time, and not something that we could ever defend in court, which is that we don't like immigrants in this country. We shouldn't be counting them anyways. Well, the Constitution. So I think that had as much to do with the Justice Department saying, oh, now it's impossible for us to make this argument. But it is amazing what it took, because there couldn't have been, literally, if Wilbur Ross had called up John Roberts or had, showed up on this front lawn of his house and said, I lied, I don't know that it could have been more explicit than, frankly, that. So that's the good news, that we know, at least have a sense of how blatant things have to be for the court to do the right thing. Let's get into the less good news. Let's talk about the gerrymandering. This is pretty devastating for democracy, isn't it? Do you think there's, and maybe there's a competition as to what's going to resonate more, this decision or the others we'll talk about in a moment, but tell us the import of these gerrymandering cases.
Yeah, it's bad. So obviously, the court here had to consider, a couple, gerrymander by Democrats in Maryland that wasn't that, transformed a 6-2 House majority to 7-1, and a more serious North Carolina gerrymander. And essentially what the court did was hold that gerrymandering was a political question. And for the non-common law people out there, that means that it's a question that the courts just cannot consider. Now, one important thing here is that even Roberts was not willing to claim that these elections were consistent with the First and 14th Amendment. So Roberts could have ruled these gerrymanders are constitutional. He didn't do that. He just said that the courts cannot remedy these things. And it's important to remember what's going on here. In the Wisconsin State House right now, in 2018, Republicans got 45% of the votes and 64% of the seats. So, Democrats won the popular vote by 8 points and got less than 40% of the seats of the legislature. That's an unbreakable gerrymander. This isn't like an old time, the gerrymander gives you a marginal advantage or protects a couple of incumbents. This is entrenching rule by one party, even if they lose decisively. And one real danger of this is that, when Kennedy was on the court doing his Hamlet routine, Republicans had to worry that, they could go too far, that they could pass the gerrymander that caused Kennedy to say, I can't stomach, sort of like what happened to Roberts in the Census case. With now that Roberts has said, I don't care, literally a party can permanently entrench itself, even if it loses elections by double digits, that's fine. They have no reason not to engage in Wisconsin-type gerrymandering, which modern computer models make very possible. And it's also worth noting that his decision is just incredibly specious. His argument, on the one hand, he argues, there's no way to possibly come up with judicial standards to apply this. And then he says, well, don't worry, state courts can take care of it. But as Kagan says, that's, you're literally saying that courts can't do what courts are already doing. Pennsylvania courts drew up a fair map. It didn't, it basically represented, it actually still slightly overrepresented Republicans, but, was much more fair. And this is the same thing we went through in the 50s, that conservatives on the court said, oh, you can't have, one person, one vote. You can't have fair districts. There's no standards. It won't work. Well, the Warren Court did that. It worked out fine. It was popular. There's no problems. So it's just nonsense to say that you couldn't come up with standards that would limit the practice. But obviously, Roberts chose not to. And the fact that, gerrymandering on balance, greatly favors Republicans is not a coincidence here.
So we have that case, and let me just, before I guess we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to just ask you one more thing about the gerrymandering, and that is what we now know about the viability of independent commissions drawing districts. And then I want to talk about a couple of cases that will have to do with the ability of regulatory agencies to function, more or less, in the future under the auspices of this Roberts Court. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back with Scott and Lou.